Everybody for joining us for today's webinar, The Importance of Verification for Climate Disclosure. We're going to go ahead and get started. So we'll just go over some quick housekeeping tips that most of you are no doubt familiar with by now. So everybody is going to be muted by default. You can ask questions at any time by typing them into the Zoom question box. But we're going to wait to answer questions till the end of the presentation. We'll have a Q&A session at the very end here. And a PDF and recording will be sent to all attendees following the presentation. So on today's webinar, you'll be hearing from myself, Ryan Cassett. I'm the manager of our verification and registry services team here at the Climate Registry. So on the agenda today, we'll start with a quick introduction about the Climate Registry for those of you who are new to the Climate Registry and unfamiliar with what we do. Then I'll talk a little bit about what exactly is verification, some of the benefits of verification, go over the verification process, talk about some verification tips for success, and leave time for a Q&A at the end. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Climate Registry. So the Climate Registry is a nonprofit organization that empowers organizations to be climate leaders. We provide best-in-class services and tools that help companies, governments, and institutions to reduce their emissions. So since 2007, we've worked hard to inspire, educate, and connect organizations so that we can be a strong, positive force in building a sustainable future. We're a nonprofit that empowers organizations to do more in the fight against climate change through credible carbon reporting. We create and manage such innovative tools such as the Net Zero Portal for the measurement and reporting of greenhouse gas emissions, and drive action and ambition by recognizing and showcasing climate leadership through convening such as the Climate Leadership Conference. The Climate Registry has a community of member organizations who transparently disclose their greenhouse gas emissions. Here are some of the organizations who are members of the Climate Registry who annually report and verify their greenhouse gas emissions. We work with organizations large and small, public and private sector, and across all kinds of industries. So this webinar is really going to be covering verification, the whole process of verification, giving an introduction about verification, and really just talking about the benefits of it too. So we'll just go in and really start from the very top here about what exactly is verification. So third-party verification is an independent review of reported emissions against specified criteria. Verification confirms that emissions are materially correct. So what is the third-party aspect of verification? That refers to using an outside organization that doesn't have any stake in the outcome of the verification. And this is different from first-party verification, which would be done in-house in your organization, or a second-party verification, which can be done by an outside organization that does have an interest in the outcome of the verification. Note that I'm using verification term here to refer to greenhouse gas emissions or carbon footprints, but verification as a process can also be used for other kinds of environmental information, such as carbon offsets, carbon footprints of products, as well as other environmental footprints. So all of these kinds of environmental information can be verified. Next, I'm going to go over a couple of key terms here that you'll hear during the presentation, starting with the top, a verification body. This is an organization that is capable of conducting verifications against criteria. You'll also hear the term verifier thrown around. Sometimes they're used a little interchangeably. During this presentation, though, we're going to refer to verification body as the organization that conducts the verification, whereas the verifiers are going to be the individual team members of the verification body who do the verifications. Um, Verification bodies, or VBs, are organizations that have to be accredited by an accreditation body uh, in order to conduct a verification. We work with the partner accreditation body, the ANSI National Accreditation Board, or ANAB, to ensure that our verifiers and verification bodies are maintaining their accreditation and high standards through conducting annual surveillance and audits. There's also materiality. So this is the very important concept for verification. This is the concept that the errors or misstatements or aggregation of misstatements could affect the decisions of anyone who's going to use the environmental information statement, whether that's the organization themselves or an outside group. Verification is basically confirming that greenhouse gas inventory has no material misstatements in it. And then finally, there is assurance. Assurance is the confidence in the environmental information statement being verified. And we'll talk about the different kinds of assurance later on in this presentation. So one quick point of clarification between two terms here, verification and validation. These two terms are sometimes used interchangeably. However, there is a difference between the two of them as far as greenhouse gas emissions are concerned. Verification is a review of historical greenhouse gas emissions, meaning that the emissions have already happened. And this is most often in the case of a greenhouse gas inventory for an organization, but it can also be for an offset project. So it'll determine the reductions that happened through the offset project. And verification is determining whether the information is materially correct and conforms to criteria. Validation, on the other hand, is a review of the outcome of future activities. So these are usually in the case of offsets or emission reduction projects where the emissions will be reduced by activities taken in the future. So validation is determining whether the assumptions and methods about future activities are reasonable, but it is not determining whether the emissions themselves are materially correct. That is verification. So the Climate Registry's verification program is aligned with the International Organization for Standardization's 14064-3 2019 verification standard. This standard serves as the basis of our program. This is what we have built our general verification protocol around, but we add additional program guidance and program requirements. And we do this because the standard is considered international best practice. The standards themselves are regularly reviewed and updated by experts. And also accreditation bodies around the world use these standards to accredit organizations to conduct verifications in a very consistent and transparent process. Okay, so that's a little bit about verification itself. Now I'll talk a little bit about why verification is important. First of all, greenhouse gas emissions result from complex sources, and they can come from complex processes. So in other words, there's a lot of complexity involved with greenhouse gas inventories. Verification is here to make sure that the inventory is accurate, that it meets reporting requirements, that it follows verification principles and accountability standards. Once you have an inventory go through verification, you can be more confident to place this data in the public domain. I've put in here the 95% accuracy threshold. Uh, that is actually the Climate Registry's verification quality standard. For ISO verification standard, it doesn't necessarily specify a percentage accuracy. But in general, the verification process is to make sure that it does meet a quality standard and it has no material misstatements here. So some of the more tangible benefits of verifications, organizations have certain recognition opportunities. Um, there is the Climate Leadership Awards that we recently hosted in Cleveland. We host this award program every year. Organizations can apply or qualify for certain awards, which do require reporting and verification as kind of prerequisites to apply. For members of the climate registry, there are these climate registered statuses that they can also qualify for. And there are more recognition opportunities out there for different organizations. An important part of verification is it can lead to improvement in data management systems. And this improvement in processes can help your subsequent reporting and verification be easier. You can also identify errors early and voluntarily before incurring potential financial penalties, especially if you're subject to some kind of mandatory reporting requirements. You can also identify reduction opportunities from an accurate baseline. And this is especially important for organizations who are setting and tracking net zero or carbon neutral goals. It's very important um, to be able to have a baseline and measure the progress in an accurate way each year. And most importantly, it enables you to be confident in the emissions you're disclosing publicly, that these emissions actually represent a true and faithful accounting of your organization's operations. And this is, especially as important now as we're seeing an increase in the number of mandatory greenhouse gas disclosure programs, such as the SEC climate rule. For organizations in California, there's California SB 253. These both contain some reporting and assurance requirements for reporters. We won't really get too much into detail into these programs in this webinar, since that could be basically an entirely separate webinar talking just about those programs, other than to note that we expect more such mandatory reporting and disclosure requirements in the future, which means that third-party verification will continue to be important for organizations to disclose their emissions. So here's an example of one of the recognition opportunities that I mentioned. This is the Climate Registered Recognition Program. So member organizations of the Climate Registry can achieve different recognition tiers by reporting and verifying their greenhouse gas emissions. And each level of these recognition tiers has certain requirements to report and verify, and also to go beyond and set base years, set goals and net zero targets, and achieve these targets. And these recognition levels are meant to amplify transparency and the importance of third-party verification in order to successfully reduce greenhouse gas emissions and achieve a net zero target. So this is just one such example of a recognition program that includes reporting and verification as a prerequisite step. Okay, so at this point, we're going to go through the actual steps of verification. We've talked about it a little bit, kind of broadly, and given some context of it. Now we're going to actually just talk about the kind of main steps of the verification. So verification is going to need to include an objective, which in this case is to reach a conclusion on the accuracy of the inventory and conformity with criteria. These criteria can be, for example, ISO 14064-1, which is the reporting, greenhouse gas reporting standard, the GHG protocol corporate standard, and then ISO 14064-3, which is the verification standard. Verifications for the climate registry members all include the verification against the general reporting protocol and the general verification protocol, which is pictured here. Verification can also include optional criteria and standards, such as the GHG protocol, Scope 3 guidance, or offsets. And I should mention that our verification protocol, our general reporting protocol, these are all publicly available documents that you can download from the Climate Registry's website. So you can use these, you can have these documents in order to refer to them and use them. So all verifications are conducted according to these 5 principles. So you find these principles in our verification protocol as well as in the ISO standard. So I'm just going to go through these. So verifications are expected to be impartial. Verification is an objective process. It's meant to be free from bias or conflicts of interest. So this gets again to the third-party aspect of verifications. Verifications are expected to be conducted using an evidence-based approach with reliable conclusions based on evidence gathered. Verifications must also reflect the results truthfully and accurately. They must be presented fairly. And documentation is meant to be the basis of the conclusion. And where presented with alternatives, verification is meant to choose the option that is cautiously moderate. The verification process can be grouped into 4 categories, which we'll go over in the coming slides. They are pre-engagement activities, verification planning, the execution of verification activities, and completion of the verification. So the first step on verification process is to select a verification body. The Climate Registry provides a list of verification bodies that are approved to conduct verifications according to our program. I've included the link here. We have a list of these bodies as well as those in the applicant process available on our website. These are ones that are recognized by our program. However, there are other verification programs out there, verification bodies, excuse me, out there who are recognized by ANAB, who are not in our program, that organizations can use as well. Organizations usually issue a request for proposals to the listed VBs in order to begin the verification process. Once you've chosen a VB, the VB is going to assess whether they have any conflict of interest with your organization before beginning the verification. And this is a situation where a verifier may be unable to provide an objective review of their data, and it's important for maintaining the principle of impartiality. The verification body is going to want to avoid and mitigate any situations of potential high conflict of interest. So once the COI process has been sorted out, then organizations can sign a contract with the verification body. And prior to signing this contract, it's important to determine the criteria for verification, the level of assurance, objectives, and the scope or what is included in the verification before signing a contract. For example, are you just going to include scope 1 and 2 emissions, or will it also include scope 3? Are you going to include other reporting protocols or guidance, maybe some reporting standards or protocols that are sector specific? Are you going to include other optional emissions data, such as your electricity data on your electricity procurement or offsets? So all of these things should really be hammered out with your verification body before you get into the contract. So as I mentioned, these are the organizations that we work with at the Climate Registry as verification bodies. So these are approved to conduct verification bodies for our member organizations. They're also accredited by ANAB to conduct verification to other standards and programs beyond the climate registries. So here's a couple of tips we recommend when choosing a verification body. As we previously mentioned, it's important that VBs avoid conflict of interest. Um, when choosing a VB, consider whether they've had a previous relationship with your organizations. While VBs are allowed to perform some services for organizations whose inventory they do verify, in general, it's considered a high conflict of interest if the VB is going to verify emissions for an organization whose inventory they helped prepare, or if they consulted with the organization on how to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So in general, if the organization, if you're working with an organization that has um, helped you develop the inventory, they can't turn around and then verify that inventory. So that's probably like the biggest conflict of interest there. But it also includes if they've offered non-greenhouse gas consulting, such as financial consulting, accounting services. And we have a whole list of uh, things considered high conflict of interest in our general verification protocol. So depending upon your industry sector too, you should seek out a verification body that actually has expertise and accreditation to conduct verifications in these sectors. Um, so these are the uh, electric power sector, manufacturing sector, oil and gas, chemical production, others. A&AB has a whole list of these different kinds of groups that verification bodies are accredited to. Um, and just because there are additional processes, additional technologies that may make a verification a little more complex, uh, that require verifications to have some additional expertise in that sector. Keep in mind also resources and availability, both yours and the potential VBs. Particularly during certain times of year, some VBs may be more or less available to conduct verifications if they also verify inventories for other mandatory reporting programs, such as the California Air Resources Board, um, Mass DEP, and various other, Canadian states and provinces that have their um, um, mandatory reporting programs. Uh, some VBs also have larger teams that may be able to, provide more resources as well. And finally, it's important to build in some flexibility to the extent you can with the contract. You might be able to do a multi-year contract with the same verification body, for instance, and that could be a cost-effective solution. Okay, so as I previously mentioned, assurance in the context of verification is the level of confidence in the outcome of the verification. And verification is going to recognize two different levels of assurance. Starting on the left here, a reasonable assurance conclusion. This generates the highest possible level of confidence that the greenhouse gas inventory is accurate and complete. To provide a reasonable level of assurance, a verification body has considered enough evidence to reduce the risk of material misstatement to an acceptably low level. A verification body expresses an opinion on whether the greenhouse gas inventory is free from material misstatements, and this is considered a positive form of opinion. Uh, and as I mentioned, certain sectors, or if you're interested in developing some kind of metrics, um, may require a reasonable level of assurance over a limited level of assurance. A limited level of assurance verification is one that has a higher acceptable verification risk than a reasonable assurance verification. So it provides less confidence in the data than a reasonable assurance conclusion. In a limited assurance verification, a VB is not going to perform as many detailed evidence gathering activities and is not going to follow data trails to the same depth as in a reasonable assurance engagement. Verification body at the end of the limited assurance engagement is going to declare that there's no evidence that the inventory is not correct based on their procedures that they've performed and any evidence that they've obtained. This is what's known as a negative form of assurance, or a negative form of opinion, excuse me. However, both of these assurances are considered, to be a form of verification. So both of these would be considered having gone through the third-party verification process. It really just depends on what your organization's goal for verification is, whether you have maybe an inventory that is not quite as complicated, doesn't have as many sources of emissions. You might be more amenable to do a limited assurance verification. Um, so those are both the options for different assurance here. All right, so now we're going to move on to the verification planning section. So once you've finalized a contract with the verification body, they're going to go ahead and develop the verification plan. So your verifier will first hold a kickoff meeting. They'll introduce members of the team and confirm the process and the schedule. After this, they're going to develop their plan to verify the inventory. And the plan is going to comprise a strategic analysis. So this is a high-level analysis to understand the activities and complexity of an organization. A risk assessment. This is an assessment that uses data provided to identify the risk of material misstatements in the inventory. And then finally, there's the evidence gathering plan. And this is going to detail the type and extent of all the evidence gathering activities designed to reduce the risk of a material misstatement. And the plan is designed to reduce the risk of material misstatements and also include the analytical procedures and verification activities that are to be conducted. So here's an overview of the different roles that verifiers have during verification. So every verification is going to have a lead verifier as well as an independent reviewer. The lead verifier who leads the verification is the person who leads the verification team. They're going to assign the verification team, while the independent reviewer is somebody who's qualified to lead the verification, or qualified to be a lead verifier, but is not actually part of the team. So they're responsible for conducting quality assurance on the verification report and opinion before it goes back to the client. A verification team can also include one or more verifiers who are team members, as well as technical experts who can provide specific industry knowledge. So verification at its core is really a risk-based process. And the verifier's risk assessment is going to focus on reducing the risk of material misstatement by focusing on the data systems, processes, emission sources, and calculations that are going to pose the greatest risk of generating a material discrepancy. Complex inventories and poor data management processes across an organization are going to pose greater risk. Verifiers are going to take that into account when they're developing their risk assessment and evidence gathering activities. And VBs are going to identify these risks by analytical procedures and by collecting data submitted by the organization. Part of the verifier's verification plan is the evidence gathering plan, which is going to describe the type and extent of all the evidence gathering activities designed to reduce the risk of a material misstatement. Verification bodies are going to collect different kinds of evidence, such as physical evidence. This would be, direct observation of emission sources, such as looking at fuel meters, looking at calibration equipment. There's also documentary evidence. So this would be taking a look at logbooks, invoices, manuals, and also interviews with personnel. The plan can also include one or more facility visits. So this would be a case where your verification body is going to send somebody or their team on site to meet, to collect different kinds of evidence here. Sometimes these site visits could be in person. Sometimes they might be done via remote methods. But oftentimes, especially a first kind of verification, especially under reasonable assurance verification, is going to include one or more facility visits. The plan also is meant to be internal, this evidence gathering plan. So as a client of a verification body, you're not going to see the verification or it's not going to see the evidence gathering plan. But they will need to coordinate with the client on scheduling a facility visit too. So that aspect would certainly be shared. So we're just kind of breezing through these steps here. Once the verifier develops their plan, they're going to conduct the verification according to the plan. This is the core verification activities here. They're going to evaluate whether there are changes to the materiality and risk threshold that have occurred over the course of the verification. They're going to evaluate whether enough evidence is collected to reach a conclusion on the accuracy of the inventory or whether they'll need to collect additional evidence. They'll also evaluate whether the inventory is complete and meets criteria and evaluate whether the misstatements that are identified during the verification are systemic and whether they add up to material errors. So once the main verification activities are complete, it's now time for the verification body to draft the verification report and opinion. Before it goes to the client, it will need to undergo an independent review by another verifier at the verification body who was not originally involved with the verification. This is the independent reviewer. Then the VB is going to send the draft report to the client, who can implement corrective action if necessary. And usually it is necessary. Usually there is some kind of corrective action that comes up during the verification process. The VB is then going to look over the corrected report and opinion, and then they're going to share it via an exit meeting with the client. Okay, so we've gone through at this point the kind of high-level overview of the verification process. We've talked about some of the benefits. Now, assuming you are interested in verification here, we're going to talk about, a couple of different tips and maybe some questions before we leave time for our Q&A session at the end here. So before you begin a verification, it's important to, first of all, complete your greenhouse gas inventory. This is going to help, be able to get the verifier to give you an accurate quote for the service if they really have an understanding of, your operations, your emission sources, prior to actually kicking off the verification will really help them to develop a good schedule. It's going to help them to develop, assess kind of the procedures, the team they need to. This is going to be really the first and kind of most important step. And also to obtain backups of all, your documentation. You're going to want to be able to clearly demonstrate how your activity got from your sources to your greenhouse gas emissions here. So having all your spreadsheets, invoices, whether you've procured any renewable energy credits, power purchase agreements, et cetera, having all that available is going to hugely improve the process of verification. We also, recommend completing an inventory management plan as a best practice. We recommend this to all our, members of the climate registry. A good place to look for an inventory management plan is the US EPA's Center for Corporate Climate Leadership. I've dropped a link to it here. They also have some great resources available to any organization who's considering verification or is really just kind of starting the process of building a greenhouse gas inventory. Okay, so now we're into the FAQ section here. I'll start with our number one most commonly asked question about verification, which is how much does it cost? The answer to this is we can't provide estimates for verification. So it is an added cost on top of the cost to complete an inventory. We don't provide cost estimates for verification for a couple of reasons. Number one, we as a greenhouse program do not ourselves provide verification services. So we can't really estimate ourselves how much something should cost. It's also done, the contracting is done confidentially between the organization and the verification body. So, we are basically kind of not able to disclose the cost estimates between organizations that contract for a verification. But that being said, there are a couple of considerations that will factor into cost. So going through these, just all kind of appearing here, if your organization has a more complicated structure, this is going to increase the cost. If you're verifying it at facilities that are a large number of facilities distributed over a big geographic region, this is going to add to the cost as well, particularly for the facility visits here. How many emissions years you're verifying at once. Now, while I mentioned this might be a good cost-effective way of, verifying multiple years of data at once, it does mean that probably 1 year of verification, if it's going to include multiple emission sources, is going to be a more expensive year, even if the cost per year is going to be less. What sources of emissions your organization has. So, whether these are kind of straightforward sources, such as on-site stationary combustion for building heating, vehicle fleets, electricity, or do you have, large emission sources of different kinds of complex sources, such as process or fugitive emissions, whether you're reporting kind of just standard CO2, CH4, N2O, or whether you get into kind of more exotic greenhouse gases like SF6, NF3, various kinds of HFC and PFCs, your reporting methodologies, the data monitoring system that you have, whether it's well documented or whether it's a little bit, harder to track down information. So all these things kind of, add into the cost here. The estimation methods, the quality assurance procedures. One just kind of general tip is we usually advise organizations to issue, RFPs to multiple VBs, including as much information as possible in your RFP. This is going to get you an accurate quote, and it's also going to get you, you'll be able to kind of see some competitive offers for services here. We do provide more verification guidance on cost factors for members of the climate registry, but these are just some ones that we can kind of share just kind of broadly here. And lastly, if you're an organization that's kind of on the other side of this, you're interested in becoming an accredited verification body, first step here is usually to, you're going to want to get accredited. And so you should inquire with ANAB as our partner accreditation body here. There's the link there to their greenhouse gas program, but you can also just go on their website and search for it that well. They have an application on their website. They also describe the process to do that. But you're going to want to gain accreditation to ISO 14065, which is the general principles and requirements of bodies validating and verifying environmental information, and then gain the ability to verify organizational or project level verifications under ISO 14064-3. So that's the verification standard. 14065 is the general principles and requirements to be able to verify as an organization. So any organization who's interested is going to want to be very familiar with both of these standards and documents there. So when an organization is applying, they'll need to indicate the climate registry as a greenhouse gas program that you wish to gain accreditation to. So ANAB has a number of GHG programs that they work with. We are one of them that they help accredit organizations to. And they will assess during the assessment process whether your organization is in compliance with TCR programs and protocols. Once they have been accredited, they will then need to participate in some TCR trainings, read some resources and protocols to make sure that they're up to speed on that. And then they are onboarded and given an orientation process through the climate registry. So we'll get them set up with our software system and et cetera. All right, so at this point, we have reached the end of the presentation. We can now pause here for some questions. Okay, so we got a couple of questions in, and please feel free to send them in right now. So just to clarify, one question is asking if verification bodies work in conjunction with the Verra Climate Action Reserve, et cetera, to determine qualifying offsets, or do they operate independently? So the answer is that these verification bodies are going to, work independently. Verra, Climate Action Reserve, American Carbon Registry, Gold Standard, these are all programs that are accredited by, they're accredited programs by ANAB. They work with ANAB. The verifiers are also approved by those programs. However, they are going to be working independently, with project developers in order to verify emissions. They also verifiers. These organizations are also likely qualified as verifiers and validators. So they'll probably be validating the outcome of offset projects and then verifying them as well. So that's a great question. So we got another question here, which is, whether TCR verification will satisfy SEC or CARB SB 253 verification requirements. That's a great question. As I mentioned, that could probably be like a whole other webinar in itself, just about those kind of disclosure programs here. What we do know from the SEC is they have assurance for different for different organizations that are subject to SEC disclosure rules, large accelerated filers, there is a requirement proposed there to uh, have an assurance of your disclosed emissions. And it is to a reasonable level of assurance, um, or limited level of assurance, depending on the year. This is kind of phased in over years, as well as what kind of filer they are. Um, and our understanding is that the SEC typically works with um, they typically have financial auditors doing this. However, they have also allowed non-financial auditors as well to do these kinds of assurance. So this can also include other standards such as ISO verification, also IAASB, I believe, as well, or ISAE, excuse me. That's the one. Sorry, not ISAE. So there's different kinds of standards there. So verification, according to an ISO standard, can be used, I believe, for the SEC rule here. For SB 253 specifically, there is an assurance requirement. I believe that right now it is being kind of worked out in the rulemaking process for this legislation, kind of what exactly that qualifies. Um, so I hope that answers the question. I'm not quite sure for SB 253 yet. It sounds like, though, based on the information given for the SEC, that an ISO verification would be acceptable under that program here. Good question. Take a look at a couple others here. Um, a question whether you need to be consecutive if you're verifying for the first time here. So if you are verifying for the first time, you don't need to be consecutive. So you can, start with years that you have, more recently, and start verifying that. If you want to go back and verify, emissions years in the past, you can also do that as well. So it doesn't need to be consecutive. That's a good question here. As I mentioned, also, you can verify multiple years at once. And yeah, we have seen organizations at the Climate Registry who have reported emissions, reported, like a current year, and they say, what, we actually have a base year of like 2006. We're going to go back and have this verified. Since verification is a historical, looking at historical data, that's certainly allowable. That's understandable. Sometimes it might take you a while to, dig back through, old emissions years. One thing to, think of is, it might, if you're reporting a year that's really, really old, it might be, that a reasonable assurance may not be possible for that, just because the data is maybe a little bit, data management systems are maybe just a little bit not tracking all that old data. So limited assurance might be a better option for that. Or also just choosing maybe like a more recent base year too, if that's just not possible. Yeah, so you have a good question here about, from the perspective of a city, that's not subject to a mandatory reporting program. They have a complex process for the inventory in terms of verification costs. but limited benefits based on what was shown, and talk a little bit about what might be the most appropriate entities to pursue verification, and how to determine if verification is right for you. So we, at the Climate Registry have organizations who report to us from, all different kinds of sectors here. Private sector, nonprofit, city, uh, state agencies. So I don't really think there's maybe one kind of organization that is most appropriate for, but it really kind of depends on your goals and what you're hoping to get out of it. Um, for an organization that maybe has limited resources, that is not maybe not um, required to do verification. Yeah, you may be wondering sort of what's the point? Why should I go through this process here? And I think it really depends upon your organization's goals for disclosure. Do you have a base year that you're measuring? Do you have greenhouse gas reduction targets that your leadership or stakeholders would like you to hit? Doing at least a verification of a base year inventory would be very, I think would be a good case to be made for verification there. Because it really kind of depends on what data you're going to be comfortable putting out. Um, we do have organizations who just report with us. They don't go through verification. So, that may be more appropriate for them. But we will say that, for organizations who are, interested in disclosing emissions, this would be, verification is really what we think of as the gold standard in terms of preparing an inventory for public consumption. You're going to have a little bit more peace of mind having another organization that's reviewed your emissions and stands by it in addition to your organization. You just say like, these emissions are materially correct, or we have not found any errors that are material in this. So I think it really just depends upon what the goals are for your organization. Now, one option here is, if you are, kind of, looking at, not having a lot of resources, maybe not able to do verification, all the time, you could do maybe a verification of a base year and a goal year. That way really kind of determine, what, whether your goals were actually hit and kind of put that out. We usually recommend that organizations do, verification every year. However, that's not always possible. You could also change the level of assurance from year to year. So maybe begin with a reasonable level of assurance for your first year, for your base year, and then do limited assurance for intervening years. So this could be a way to kind of reduce the costs of verification over the years, but make sure that you're continuing to improve your processes. So sorry, that's a bit of a long-winded answer here, but I did think that was a very good question, a very good question to ask here. And yeah, it's really going to depend upon what your goals are for reporting and disclosure here. All right. So I think that at this point we have come to the end of our questions. If there are any other questions that people have, I might give it maybe like 30 seconds here to type in your question. But if you also have any other questions here, you can certainly reach out to us at the Climate Registry and ask these questions. Again, thank you for attending the webinar today. We hope to see you in future webinars.